journalism, some people are determined to undermine and disrespect it. And at the same time, around the world, reporters are literally risking their lives to uncover the truth. Today, our guest is Sewell Chan. He's the editor-in-chief of the Texas Tribune. He has a personal history with France and insight into the relationship between France and the US. We talk about the dark web, understanding extremism, and how journalists have to report the facts and at the same time still manage to write with compassion, grace, and context. Here's our conversation. Let's start with something that has been in the works for a couple of months now, and it's brand new to your newsroom at the Texas Tribune. Tell us about your democracy reporter. I saw the job description. It was pretty intense. What were you looking for, and how did you know that you had chosen the right person?
Yeah, sure. Thanks. As an American journalist and as a senior editor for the last several years, I've been witnessing, along with many of us, certain dismaying trends, rising mistrust and erosion of confidence in institutions and in leaders, rising misinformation and disinformation, especially targeted at listeners and viewers who may not be sophisticated consumers of news, or who may not have the equipment to tell what is verified from what is false. And then, of course, among other disturbing trends, kind of a rise in extremism that, of course, we saw here in January 6th of 2021, but also is unfortunately not isolated, and it's part of kind of a global phenomenon. So I believed that traditional newsrooms, we can't just be looking at formal political actors and their votes and decisions. Those are very important things to cover. And at the Texas Tribune, we're still very focused on covering state government. But we posted for and then hired a democracy reporter, really, frankly, to focus on threats to democracy, whether that comes from extremism, misinformation, could even come from the realm of kind of political violence, and to really take a hard, serious look at where those threats were coming from and why these messages are resonating with ordinary people.
The job description said it's a new beat and it's an intense one. You actually laid that out flat online for the potential recipient of that title. Tell us what you meant by that. How did you know that it would be intense?
Well, I think a lot of the organizing activity and even kind of the chatter around that's used by people who are at political extremes often takes place right in these, kind of semi-underground or even underground digital communities. And so I'm counting places like Discord or Reddit that, of course, mainstream people also use. But I'm also talking about the so-called dark web and other areas where, there is often, illicit activity, whether that means threatening statements or even, of course, laundering of money or et cetera. And so, obviously, we're very, very careful to only observe and never break any of those laws ourselves. But I do think that to understand, extremism, I think to understand, the modern so-called militia movement, to understand people who are doing organizing among like-minded people, you have to go to some dark places in the internet. And so we hired a reporter actually who is very distinguished by his reporting he did about the Southern Baptist Convention. Obviously a different beat, but he was able to report very powerfully on some cases of abuse there, and that required him to, make sources and get trust with people who, had been very traumatized or very victimized. And so I think he brings a level of compassion and maturity to covering the democracy beat for us. And his name is Robert Downen.
Now, you talk about that, the sympathy and the empathy that you have to have towards other people's points of view. Is that something that journalists had to worry about 50 years ago, 20 years ago, about the sensitivities that the readers have on a specific topic? Or is this something new that we have to pay attention to?
I don't think it's entirely new, Tracy. I mean, I think journalism, the best journalism, has always been characterized by lucidity, curiosity, and empathy. And so you do have to have a very, very clear, analytical, precise way of thinking about the world and asking the right questions. you need to have the curiosity to recognize that anything involving humans is probably a lot more complex than it might first appear, and avoid the tendency to go completely reductionist or oversimplify so much that the nuance gets lost. And then finally, I do believe we need to have empathy for our sources and for the people that we write about, and for the people to whom we are seeking to serve with our writing. I want to be clear that empathy does not mean false equivalency. I am not suggesting that we go out into the field and quote a climate change denier alongside a climate scientist with actual expertise on atmospheric warming. That's not what I'm talking about. But I am talking about being able to write with a certain degree of compassion and grace, even about people or regarding people who may be doing very unpleasant or dangerous things. And, I believe that ultimately, as reporters, our most important role is to bear witness, to observe, to analyze, to chronicle, and to document, and not so much to judge. It's a very, very easy time right now to rush to judgment. And with so much, tumultuous news and so many bad things going on, I can understand the impulse that people feel to make their opinion known. I understand that I think quite well, and I'm sympathetic to it. But I think ultimately, as fact-based journalists, our job really needs to be able our job has to be contribute to the foundation of facts upon which values and trade-offs and discussions about history and principles can then be discussed. If we don't have that factual foundation, then those discussions about values and trade-offs are not going to be very meaningful or well-informed.
When I went to journalism school, it was pretty cut and dried. It was, ask the people the question, and whatever their answer is, quote them on that and let the reader decide what the truth is. But it's hard now when we have entered an era where, first of all, people don't trust the media as much. So already you're being spoken to from a different vantage point in some cases. And also the politicians no longer have to go behind the door in certain cases to say what they think is true, they want to be true, but isn't necessarily true. So there's this whole other layer of discretion and openness, and also that empathy that you're talking about, to say, I understand why they believe this, but I have to report on it a certain way. How tough is that in your newsroom?
Yeah, great question. Well, first of all, even when we were quoting ordinary people, I think we always use discretion in terms of quoting them, because if they're misinformed or say something that's inaccurate, merely the fact that there are quote marks around it does not, serve the reader. And certainly if they say anything defamatory, you're not off the hook just because it was in quote marks. And so in some ways, I don't think the fundamentals have changed. What I think has changed is as you describe, Tracy, there is a kind of openness to, frankly, the dishonesty and the attacks on media. Look, it is not new that politicians, try to go around the press, the institutions, to go directly to the people. Obviously, that would have been a very familiar technique from Franklin D. Roosevelt to Charles de Gaulle, and the use of, mass mediums to reach a broad public, especially radio in that era, then television, of course, then the era of kind of social and digital media that we're on. Maybe AI is next. So I'm not surprised or even that disturbed when politicians seek to bring their message directly to the people. What does concern me is that if their statements are not accurate, then we in the press must contextualize them and must interpret and explain what part is true, what part is partly true but lacking in sufficient context, and what part, if anything, is flatly untrue and easily disproved. I think, secondly, I'm troubled, Tracy, when politicians, not limited to the United States, refuse to engage with the media altogether, saying we're fake news, we're partisan, we're liars, we can't be trusted, or even that we're the enemy of the people. I want to be very careful here. I think media have to be very humble and be very really listening right now. And the fact that mistrust in the press is so high is something that we journalists must take seriously. I do not think we can afford to, either morally or financially, to say, oh, that's just ignorant talk, or that's just what, extremism has led people to believe, or, oh, that's all the fault of cable in the US. That's only the fault of cable news and talk radio. Those things may be factors, but I think we have to do a much better job deeply listening to the audiences we're trying to cover and serve. What are their everyday concerns? How do they perceive politics? Which is often very, very different from how journalists and people highly engaged in the political world interact with politics. So I think being better listeners is one way that we can address this trust crisis.
One of the things that was in that job description that I keep referring to for the democracy reporter was a thick skin would be helpful. And I smiled when I saw that, because I think that applies for any journalist. But as someone in your position, you're the editor-in-chief of an important newspaper. How do you make sure that young reporters who are coming into your newsroom, that they have the support that they need, but also to have that humility that you're encouraging them to have?
Frankly, I think all of us, it behooves almost all of us, and even if you're in fields different, like medicine and law, but it's probably helpful in general to not be defensive when you're criticized. And I think you can be responsive without being defensive. So, even if someone accuses you of something you didn't do, or they didn't get the facts quite right, I think, listening to their perspective and then explaining your own position, but in a way that's not judgmental or personalized, is probably just good advice for living for all of us. So when I do receive criticism, whether it's public, like on Twitter or Facebook, or whether it's emails to me, I really try to take the time to respond. I consider, my position to be one of privilege, and I have to be willing to listen to people where they are. For example, I have a long running correspondence now with a gun owner who is mostly a hunter and shooter, but has a lot of, deeply believes in the Second Amendment. And, he'll send me a lot of data, regarding gun ownership. And he asks really tough questions, actually. One of those tough questions is, and he's a fact-based guy. He saw the reporting we've produced showing that a greater proportion of gun massacres are now being committed using these semi-automatic rifles like the AR-15. But he also points out that handguns are still used. Illegal handguns are still used for a majority of crimes committed in the U.S. And both things can be true at the same time. And so one of the things I love about our exchange is, he probably does not quite share the viewpoints of maybe a lot of our readers or a lot of the public outside of Texas, but I learn a lot from him, and I'll often pose questions back to him and try to understand his logic. And I think that, once we stop doing that, we've kind of allowed ourselves to be in this hermetically sealed world. And I think that's just terribly boring. Not to mention bad journalism.
You've worked in so many different markets for really impressive outlets. What do you see as the difference when you're working with a really big newspaper with wide coverage versus smaller communities? Is all journalism local, or what is the interaction that you have with the readers there?
Well, you've heard the Tip O'Neill expression, all politics is local. And lately, in the last few years especially, it seems to be completely turned on its head. All politics is national now. I don't think, either is completely accurate. But I do think what you've seen, Tracy, in the United States is a substantial erosion of state and local news. And this means that there are far fewer people covering state legislatures, city councils, town meetings, school boards, water district meetings, utility board meetings, stuff that might sound pedestrian or mundane, but it's actually the substance of our democracy. If a contract for a sewer pipe is not, bid out honestly or fairly, or if it goes to the politician's friend or campaign donor and is not based on transparent criteria, or if the school board isn't being run honestly by people whose first concern is, the quality of the instruction and the ability of the students to be safe and to thrive, those are really issues that affect Americans very, very deeply. I would argue in some ways affecting them more deeply than some of what gets debated in Congress. But unfortunately, with our modern ecosystem, all the cable news shows, the major national newspapers, the focus really has been on federal government. I can understand why. The debates happening at the federal level are both fierce and highly important. But I also think that especially in a federal system like the US or Canada or Germany, there has to be an understanding that there are multiple layers of government, each of which has a strong impact on the lives of ordinary citizens. And I think things got out of whack a bit. And so I love working actually at this subnational level. We're the largest state news organization in the second largest state and the most conservative of the large states. And I think that gives us an especially important role to try to, bridge the divides and try to reach all sorts of Texans with fact-based and impartial news.
But speaking of reaching people, is there a different onus now on journalists to say everything you just said? Those meetings are kind of hard to follow, kind of boring. They're not clickbait. That sewer contract is not clickbait, right? We have to make, as journalists, we have to make these issues more palatable for an audience. Does that change the onus of our responsibility and also the way we deliver the news? Do we have to make sure that we are doing it in a way that will make them want to click on it?
Well, good questions. And this is where I think actually AI might be helpful. There are so many news deserts. 1 in 5 Americans, Tracy, lives in a so-called news desert. Research by Penelope Muse Abernathy, now at Northwestern University, shows just how deleterious this has been. When local news disappears, trust increases, partisanship increases, and even taxes increase because there's fewer watchdogs to ensure that public money is honestly spent. So, we've seen the consequences of this. Now, I think the onus really cuts both ways. I think we have an obligation as journalists to try to tell stories in compelling ways that connect the activities of politicians and lawmakers and judges and regulators to the lived experiences of ordinary people. We have to show folks why decisions made by those in power actually have an impact on their lives. I think the onus, however, also cuts the other way. We need to have a citizenry that's informed enough and well-served enough by our education system that people understand civics, that they understand the role of the citizen as the most important actor in a democratic republic, and that the job of citizen is a hugely important one. And I'm not in any way judging people who might just barely be getting by economically, trying to put food on the table for their kids, maybe hold down multiple jobs. I know it's hard out there. It's very hard. And so, we in the news media have to do a better job of producing coverage that's compelling and relevant and useful to ordinary folks. Though I also think that our schools have a responsibility, our museums and libraries have a responsibility. And as a society, we have a responsibility to say, hey, being a citizen is important. It's not about sound bites. It's not about, encouraging politicians who mock and insult each other. It's actually about pretty serious stuff that if we took the time to understand, we would understand why the trade-offs are difficult and why no party has all the answers and certainly no ideology has all the answers, and why we have to actually look at that combination of facts and values in order to come up with the right decisions for our society.
But there we go with the empathy again, because everybody's busy. Everybody's attention is being drawn by such attractive things, be it short videos or different types of social media. And so it's kind of like having to eat your vegetables when there's a fast food restaurant right there, right? And so we're the makers of those vegetables. What should your paper be telling its journalists on how to do their job even better?
Well, Tracy, it's a great question, although I know you're not saying this, but I want to correct the impression I sometimes hear that there was a golden age of news, in the U.S. that's typically associated with the 35 years after the end of World War II, but also a very similar period, les Trente Glorieuses in France, right? Usually used to refer to a time of economic growth, integration of the European economy, et cetera, not media focused. But we do have a tendency to see those post-war decades as, times when things were moving ahead very positively. And in many ways they were, right? I mean, after the tragedies of the Depression and the war, obviously so much of the world needed to be rebuilt. America's industrial base had largely survived. So it was a time of greater prosperity and a larger middle class. And I think that time also saw the groundedness of a more professional ethos of journalism. But we got to remember that's actually relatively new. in the late 18th century, through the 19th century, the penny press, the scurrilous press, newspaper publishers were using their platforms to encourage the U.S. to go to war against Spain. In the early republic, people were accusing their political rivals of, having children out of wedlock and having affairs and even worse, right? So, the idea that there was this golden time of kind of civility and consensus, I think is not quite true. What I do think is true, though, is that in that post-war period, we had a greater faith in institutions, and there was a broad middle class, so that whether it was, Cronkite on CBS, watching Walter Cronkite, or later on Dan Rather, there were fewer options, frankly, to consume as media. And so it doesn't mean I think we were necessarily more unified as a people, but I do think we at least had common touchstones and reference points. Most business people read the Wall Street Journal. Most people in political leadership read the New York Times and accepted what was reported as factual. Now, we're in a very different time now, frankly. And then even over my 14 years at the New York Times, I saw that difference. A lot of even leaders now, unfortunately, are consuming mostly news and information that either confirms their existing biases or that is part of, what their political base listens to. And I think that's very dangerous. I actually think it's less a problem in economic journalism because, frankly, the markets are the markets. If you don't understand the direction the treasuries are moving in or the challenges facing the Eurozone, you're probably not going to make a lot of money or hold on to it for very long. But when it comes to other kinds of news, political, cultural, I am fearful that the fragmentation of the media ecosystem, which doesn't mean I think only big legacy organizations should be the ones providing the information. I'm not at all saying that, but I'm saying that the fragmentation of the information ecosystem has to be accompanied by, higher levels of news literacy. People should be skeptical of what they're reading, who's paying for it, who controls it. Is this thing I'm reading, do they have a code of ethics? We do. Do they publish corrections? We do. Do they acknowledge when they make mistakes? We do. And so when people ask me, well, what should I read? I always avoid that answer because it can be politically quite fraught. But what I ask is that whatever information source you choose, look at the about page, read the fine print. Who owns this thing? What is their agenda? And, I wish there were a little bit more skepticism because then we wouldn't have, all that misinformation we've had where, people are sending around emails saying, oh my gosh, I just saw this email that says that, the vaccine will kill you. And, well, where did that email come from? What agenda are they trying to drive? And what do the experts have to say? Which doesn't mean that the vaccine issue hasn't been tremendously complicated. Mm-hmm. But I'd rather that people go to CDC. I'd rather people look at peer-reviewed research and read about it from experienced health and science journalists rather than just, random stuff that floats to them across the internet.
We should all be checking our sources is what I'm hearing you say.
Exactly.
And, I do want to, you teased us a little bit with the French, with your beautiful French accent. So I do want to talk about your relationship with France. But before we do that, I want to end when we talk about journalism on a positive note when it comes to the changes and the evolution of journalism in just your short time in journalism. And that's people who are being recognized and seeing the diversity, hearing the differences in voices, the differences in backgrounds. I mean, when you talk about Walter Cronkite, man, news looked so different back then and not necessarily in an accurate, reflective way of who was watching him.
Well, that's right. I mean, I've been in journalism almost 30 years, so it doesn't feel that short. But I do agree that there have been tremendous changes in terms of racial and ethnic diversity. Obviously, women are now a majority of many newsrooms and certainly a majority of graduates coming out of journalism school. The technological changes, I think, have introduced certain problems, especially with the revenue model and advertising. But it also means that in many ways, the news is more democratized than before. It was not easy in 1984 to obtain a copy of the New York Times unless you were in a big city. You get a copy mailed to you, but then you get it a couple days late. And so the instantaneity of information and the variety of options, I think that part's exciting. I think, again, people can find more choice now of who to listen to. There are many journalists who have foregone institutions altogether, and they've gone to Substack or they've set up their own blogs or websites, thinking that they don't, need an institution. They have followers, and those followers will get their newsletter. And so I think it's a time of tremendous excitement. There's obviously been a revolution as well in documentary production, many ways to tell fact-based storytelling. So that's the good part. I think the areas journalism still needs to work on are as journalism became more professionalized in the U.S., I think it became harder frankly, for some journalists to communicate with people who don't have college degrees, people who feel left behind because of automation and globalization, people who live in communities that have not seen a lot of investment and growth. And these are a lot of voters, in both Europe and the U.S. who have turned, understandably, I would argue, to certain populist or populist arguments, and in some cases even extremist arguments, because they do not feel their anger has been heard, and they feel that elite journalists are concentrated in New York or Paris and aren't going out enough. And so again, I think there's an extreme version of that critique, which I think is unfair. But I also think that there's a part that we journalists need to do to really take diversity seriously in all dimensions, which includes, hiring people who went to, small public colleges or community college, not, being very, hiring more people who've been military veterans, hiring more people who grew up in small towns, and truly taking diversity in every respect seriously, so that a variety of positions are reflected in every newsroom, including, for example, people from a disability perspective, or people who may have grown up deeply religious, who frankly are not always well represented in American newsrooms. So when we talk about diversity, I'm very supportive of it. And I think we just have to have a very rich, complex understanding of how we achieve that diversity.
Tell us a little bit about, you were named by the French American Foundation. You were chosen as an American young leader. Tell us about your relationship with France and where that brought you.
Well, sure. Thanks for asking. I first visited France when I was a poor grad student, and actually, I remember I've gone to France from England both by ferry and then, of course, by train. But I grew up middle school and high school. I studied French for 6 years and took 1 year of literature in college. So I've really had a great love of the French language, a love of French ideas. I've loved thinking about the ways in which France and the U.S. are so similar. We're now very complex, diverse democracies, but democracies really grounded in these Enlightenment ideals. And yes, with a bit of a revolutionary spirit, which I think you still see reflected at times in our politics today. France and the U.S., are a very, very important part of the story of the 18th century and of what became a flowering of democracies around the world. And finally, France and the U.S. share a lot of universalist aspirations. I'm sure each country at times often, does not manage to achieve those ideals. But the fact that we have them, I think, is something that speaks very, very powerfully to the relationship between the two countries. Anyway, sorry for going on, but I've traveled intermittently within France, have had a chance to meet, terrific French friends in different spheres through the Young Leaders Program, which I did in 2009 and 10. Had a chance to visit Marseille, and our French counterparts had a chance to visit Chicago. So it's, each year of the fellowship is in a different, it alternates between the countries. And so we really get a taste of each other's milieus. And within France, I've had a chance just to travel to beautiful places, whether it's Mont Saint-Michel or the beaches at Normandy, or, really ancient cities like Reims. I also had the privilege of being part of the New York Times team that covered the climate negotiations in 2015 at Le Bourget outside of Paris. So yeah, I have a deep affection for France and look forward to the next time I can get back there.
Well, it's nice to hear you speak in such glowing terms, and we're so fortunate that you joined us here today to talk about the role that you currently have and the tasks that you have ahead of you in ushering in the next generation of journalists as editor-in-chief of your newspaper. So thank you so much for taking the time to speak to us today.
Thank you, Tracy, for such an engaging discussion. Really appreciate it.
Thanks for listening. Let us know what you think of the show and who you'd like to hear us talk to. Please subscribe and rate this podcast. That way more people will hear about it. Thanks so much for listening. Au revoir.